as you wave me goodbye. Cheerio, here I go on my way. Wish me luck as you wave me goodbye. With a cheer, much cheer, make it gay.
Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes. I'm the host, Dr. John David Alforts. Today's episode is called Aerial Dogfights and Headhunters, the amazing story of Jefferson DeBlanc and the battle for the Solomon Islands. A special shout out to our listeners joining us in Germany, Switzerland, Thailand, and Australia, as well as here in the United States. Welcome. Captured by headhunters and imprisoned in bamboo cage, fighter ace Jefferson DeBlanc discovered exactly how much his life was worth. We'll also learn in this episode about the daily dogfights that Carl "Bud" DeVere had a front row seat to view as World War II aces Joe Foss and Jefferson DeBlanc took on Japanese Zeros. Now, during the 1990s, while serving as a teacher with the Department of Defense schools in Bad Kreuznach, Germany, my young family and I were able to visit many of the sites associated with World War II, from the beaches of Normandy, where the D-Day landings took place, to the Ardennes Forest, where the Battle of the Bulge was fought, to the death camps of Dachau, Buchenwald, and Auschwitz, where Hitler tried to enact his final solution. We saw exactly what was at stake in World War II, when not only the survival of democracy, but of human rights itself was on the line. I began writing to World War II veterans to thank them for their sacrifices. I invited them to share their stories with me, and I promised I'd keep them alive in the classes I taught. What I couldn't have predicted, though, was that veterans shared my letters with their buddies and printed them in reunion newsletters. I soon heard from over 140 World War II veterans, including 20 Medal of Honor recipients. I had more material than I could ever use in class, so to keep my promise, I wrote Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes, the book that these podcasts are based on. The book and these podcasts are my promise fulfilled. Episode 4. In August of 1942, the U.S. launched its first major amphibious landing of World War II in the Solomon Islands. The Japanese intended to use the islands as a base to disrupt supply routes to Australia and New Zealand. Much of the fighting took place on Guadalcanal, the largest island. The GIs who landed there on August 7, 1942, initially met with little resistance and quickly took Lunga Point Airfield, calling it Henderson Field instead. Despite gaining air superiority rather quickly once Henderson Field was established in Guadalcanal, the fighting in the Solomon Islands, and especially at Guadalcanal, became a bitter war of attrition as both sides fought feverishly for months on land, sea, and air for the strategically important islands. Because of the Allied air superiority, the Japanese were forced to resupply their soldiers at night. In what became known as the Tokyo Night Express, Japanese destroyers or submarines would quickly drop off reinforcements or supplies to their desired location and then rush back to their base, completing their mission in one night before they could be detected. 2 months after the Battle of the Solomon Islands began, Carl "Bud" DeVere of Alexandria, Virginia, landed at Guadalcanal Island with the 2nd Diver Bomber Squadron on October 13, 1942. As they awaited further orders, a few of the young Marines took advantage of the uneventful landing to climb 20 to 30 feet palm trees to pick the green nuts that grew near the top. The Marines were soon told to march about 1,000 yards to their tent camp. Many never made it there. About halfway to the camp, Japanese dive bombers began pounding the American ships in the harbor and dropping bombs on nearby Henderson Field. With nightfall approaching and near constant bombing and artillery fire going on, the Marines decided to put up their tents and dig 2-man foxholes about halfway between the airfield and the beach. The coral was too solid, though, to build much of a foxhole, and DeVere and his buddy Bert managed to dig a hole of only about 10 inches. The fact that the Japanese explosions were growing ever closer was not lost on DeVere. "Well, you don't have to be a genius to figure what the Japanese were trying to do. They were raking with a salvo every 100 yards from Henderson Field to the water's edge. Each time they fired, our chances of survival in that hole shortened. Those naval gunners intended to wipe out every living being from beyond the field to the shoreline." With their shallow hole offering scant protection, DeVere and his buddy Bert decided to run for the banks of a stream they'd noticed earlier in the day, about 200 yards to the right of the shelling. Once there, they watched as enemy artillery lit up the night. DeVere described the scene. "An eerie pallor outlined everything in the ground. Flares swung back and forth on parachutes as they dropped, causing fires on the ground. The red flames made the place look like a scene from hell." As the two men lay side by side in the mud, DeVere tried to lift his buddy's spirits, pointing out that despite the bombing, the full moon sure was a beauty. His buddy Bert responded, "With that damn moon shining and them flares lighting up the whole place, every chap on the island could see us lying here." DeVere gave up after that. A few seconds later, a Japanese bomber dropped a couple of bombs so close to the two men that the concussion blast threw both men in the air, knocking the wind out of them and momentarily deafening DeVere. Finally, when debris from the explosion, water, trees, limbs, rocks, mud, and wreckage stopped falling, other bombs exploded near the airfield. Bert, this time in a well-controlled, quiet voice, whispered calmly, "I've been hit. It's my leg." DeVere touched his buddy's leg, and he felt a lot of blood. With his cigarette lighter, DeVere could see a large hole in Bert's thigh. He used his belt to make a tourniquet for Bert, and he yelled for a medic. Bert remained calm, instructing DeVere to keep his gear and not to mention the wound in any letters to his family until he was recovered. The next morning, after the Japanese attack on Guadalcanal's Henderson Field had ended, DeVere learned that his squadron's commanding officer and two other officers had all been killed by one of the first Japanese shells which landed directly on their tent. DeVere found his own tent still standing, but littered with holes from shrapnel. The Japanese battleships had fired 900 14-inch shells during the attack, making it the most devastating naval shelling, aerial bombing, and artillery fire ever inflicted on ground troops up to that point in the war. "Most of our pilots and gunners were killed, and since I was just out of boot camp with no professional field yet established, I tried to volunteer as a rear seat gunner, but I was rejected because I could not send Morse code with a sending key." Instead, DeVere became the first control tower operator at Henderson Field. "A dubious title," he wrote, as "no one prior to me wanted to take a chance in the wooden tower that the Seabees had erected." Although the Japanese frequently came over strafing and bombing, DeVere was never struck while he was in the tower. From the control tower, DeVere had a front row seat to watch and listen on the radio to fighter pilot Joe Foss of Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 121 as he engaged in daily dogfights with the Japanese. Foss was the lead pilot of the group of 8 Wildcats, which became known as Foss's Flying Circus. Both the American Wildcat and the Japanese Zero were single-seat fighter planes. While the Japanese Zero was more agile in the air, the Wildcat had superior firepower with 650 caliber machine guns, as opposed to the Zero's two 20mm cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns. In 3 months of combat, Foss's Flying Circus was credited with shooting down 72 Japanese aircraft, including 26 by Foss himself, thus matching the record set by World War I's top fighter ace Eddie Rickenbacker. Foss survived numerous close calls. He made an emergency landing at Henderson Field after his own F-4F Wildcat was shot up. With no engine or flaps and 3 Japanese Zeros on his back, Foss landed at full speed, barely missing the nearby grove of palm trees. He also had to abandon his own aircraft at sea off the island of Maleta after it was shot up. 50 years later, on November 16, 1992, DeVere finally met the Medal of Honor recipient in person when Foss came to a bookstore in Alexandria to sign copies of his autobiography, A Proud American. Joe Foss inscribed, "To Bud DeVere, one of our boys from Guadalcanal, God bless you, Joe Foss." DeVere wrote that it was one of the most proudest moments of his life. Jefferson DeBlanc of Lockport, Louisiana, was another one of the fighter pilots DeVere watched intently from the Henderson Field control tower. On January 31st, 1943, Lieutenant DeBlanc led a 6-plane section of Fighter Squadron 112 as it escorted 12 dive bombers and torpedo planes targeting a Japanese fleet headed towards Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands. That fateful afternoon, DeBlanc flew a Wildcat nicknamed the Impatient Virgin. Even before the enemy was in sight, DeBlanc knew he was in trouble, as his Wildcat was burning too much fuel, his fuel gauge dropping fast. "I had drawn a lemon, a real gas guzzler," he remembered. Unless he turned and headed back to base, as 2 of the other 6 fighters had already done, DeBlanc wasn't going to have enough fuel to get back. But still he kept going. "We needed all the guns we could get up there to escort those dive bombers. I figured if I run out of gas, I run out of gas. I figured I could survive a bailout. You gotta live with your conscience, and my conscience told me to go ahead." As a Japanese fleet came into view, the American dive bombers went to work bombing them. The Japanese responded with anti-aircraft fire. 2 Japanese float planes attacked the Wildcats. DeBlanc responded with his machine guns, hitting both Japanese planes. One went down in a tailspin as the other exploded. "There were 2 of them going after one of our dive bombers. They would have nailed him. No way they would have missed. I burned them both," DeBlanc recalled. Then came the Japanese Zeros, 10 to 12 of them. DeBlanc was flying low, just 50 feet above the water, and the Japanese Zeros didn't see him. He was able to open fire first. DeBlanc believed he took out the lead Zero, but no one actually saw it go down. Then he hit the lead's wingman, locking into his tail as he tried to escape upward, going into a slow roll. "He was looking around, trying to figure out what was happening," DeBlanc said. "I nailed him." The American dive bombers began strafing and dropping incendiary bombs on the Japanese fleet. The Toa Maru, carrying Japanese tanks and ammunition, lit up, its Japanese crew unable to put out its fires. The Japanese responded with more Zeros. 2 of them closed in on DeBlanc. With his fuel already too low to return to base, DeBlanc took on the Zeros. As DeBlanc kept firing his machine guns, one of the Zeros burst into flames. Even on fire, the Zero raced towards him. "He was going to ram me," DeBlanc said, "kamikaze style. I was really frightened then, so I just held the trigger down, and he blew up into pieces, and I flew through the pieces." The other Zero came in from above DeBlanc, moving fast, but DeBlanc was able to throw his own plane into a skid by pulling his throttle way back and popping his flaps. The Zero flew past him. "To this day I would recognize his face," DeBlanc said. "He came up so close and we looked at each other from our cockpits. We were right adjacent to each other, flying wingtip to wingtip. I'd like to say he knew he was a dead man, but I won't say that." As the Zero overshot him, DeBlanc fired, taking it down. Right after he went down, I should have looked around to see if there were others, DeBlanc said. I didn't. I looked at my watch. I made a mistake. DeBlanc's watch was shot off his wrist by a bullet that came through the cabin. More bullets hit the Wildcat, spraying DeBlanc with shrapnel, shredding his propeller, and setting the cockpit on fire. There was nothing DeBlanc could do but bail out of the burning craft, parachuting into the ocean. Although his back, arms, and legs were badly wounded with shrapnel from the firefight, DeBlanc somehow managed to swim 6 hours before coming ashore to Kolombangara, which was occupied by the Japanese. The guy who shot me down, he saw me bail out, DeBlanc said in a 2001 article in the States Time Morning Advocate of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He knew I was alive. I knew the Japanese, were looking for me. But I'm not a pessimist. I knew I would survive. I was raised in the swamps. DeBlanc managed to elude capture for several days, living off coconuts and hiding in an abandoned hut. Once his wounds had healed a bit, DeBlanc hoped he could steal a Japanese Zero fighter and fly it back to Guadalcanal. But an indigenous tribe of headhunters soon found him. Now captured, placed in a bamboo cage which became his prison. The tribesmen entertained themselves by tormenting DeBlanc, laughing at how his sunburned skin turned white when they poked it with their sticks. Meanwhile, the tribe's elders beat their drums, made from hollow logs, in a kind of Morse code, as they tried to decide what to do with him. The natives, DeBlanc concluded, sent word with their drums that they had picked me up, and they wanted to know what to do with me. DeBlanc feared that he could soon become the main course in the tribe's large pot that simmered over the fire. After one full day of imprisonment in the bamboo cage, another indigenous native arrived carrying a 10-pound bag that he presented to DeBlanc's captors. DeBlanc wrote in a 2000 letter to me that the contents of that bag saved his life. You see, I know exactly how much I am worth. A sack of rice. I was picked up by headhunters in the Solomon Islands after I had been shot down early in the Guadalcanal campaign. We were not winning the war then, and the native islanders are not stupid. Most of them, during these dark days, were with the winners, that is, the Japanese. I was very lucky since I was traded to the Coast Watchers' loyal natives for a sack of rice. The tribesman who traded the bag of rice to save DeBlanc was named Atitao Loducalo. He had been connected to the Coast Watchers, a group of islanders who spied on the Japanese aircraft and ships in the Solomons and rescued downed Allied pilots. Because of Atatu's bag of rice, DeBlanc's life was spared, and he went on to fight another day. After his wounds were treated in a U.S. Naval hospital, DeBlanc, now a captain, again returned to the Pacific, where he resumed his service as a fighter pilot during the Marshall Islands campaign until May 1945, and to Okinawa and the Ryukyu Islands until the end of the war. By the war's end, DeBlanc was credited with shooting down 9 Japanese aircraft. On December 6, 1946, DeBlanc was invited to the White House by President Harry S. Truman to receive the Medal of Honor. DeBlanc was accompanied by his former high school sweetheart, now his young wife Louise, his father, and his 2 sisters, along with his boss from the sawmill that he had gone to work for after the war. As he presented the nation's highest military honor to DeBlanc, President Truman said to him, "I'd rather have that medal than be President of the United States." After the war, DeBlanc left active military service, but stayed in the Marine Corps Reserves, retiring as a colonel in 1972. DeBlanc went into education, earning 2 master's degrees and a doctorate in education. He spent many years working in St. Martinville Parish Public Schools in Louisiana before also teaching with the DoD schools. In his letters to me in 1999 and 2000, DeBlanc was eagerly planning his last return to the Solomon Islands, where he hoped to meet up again with Ati, the islander whose bag of rice saved his life. Ati was 95 at the time, DeBlanc 80. As DeBlanc poignantly wrote in his January 3, 2000 letter, "I will be returning to the Solomon Islands this month to meet, God willing, with Ati, the native islanders who saved my life. It will be full circle for me." DeBlanc was well aware that for Ati and himself, the runway was getting shorter for both of us. If it hadn't been for Ati, I wouldn't be here, and my grandchildren wouldn't be here. I feel obligated to him. Before I check out, I want to pay my debt. Simple as that, and I can only do it face to face. DeBlanc got his wish. The 2 men were reunited. They posed for pictures and saluted one another. Life had indeed come full circle for DeBlanc. Although the Japanese soldiers continued to fight valiantly, by January 1943, American forces on the island numbered 50,000 men, with 24,000 actually fighting, compared to just 11,000 Japanese soldiers. Despite being badly outnumbered, the Japanese fought for every yard at Guadalcanal until the last Japanese soldiers were killed, captured, or evacuated. The stubborn Japanese fighting force at Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands forewarned the Allied soldiers of the bitter battles that awaited them throughout the Pacific theater.
Till we meet once again, you and I. Wish me luck as you wave me goodbye.
Our song today was "Wish Me Luck as You Wave Me Goodbye," which was a big hit by Gracie Fields during World War II. I want to thank you for joining us today for Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes. Please follow our podcast, and please also leave a review if you like what you heard. There will be more podcasts released bi-weekly. The book is available, Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes, on Amazon.com. Thank you for joining, and we'll see you next week.